Level up your LA Kings experience with the new Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access. Enjoy great seats to the game along with premier dining inside the Lexus Club with all-you-can-eat food and non-alcoholic beverages. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings item and parking with your purchase. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn rewards on each purchase from the only ticket company that rewards you for buying. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings.
You're listening to an LA Kings podcast. For more episodes of this and every other Kings program, visit lakings.com/podcast.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
Welcome back, Kings fans. I am Jesse Cohen. This is All the Kings Men. Because this summer was always going to be packed with talk about the new logo and other stories, and the schedule was always going to be condensed, we came at our content plan a little differently this summer. We've still got one more episode in addition to this one to publish between now and the draft. And then the draft happens on Friday and Saturday. Hopefully we'll be giving you episodes more in line with how we've approached them in past seasons. I really liked how we came at the draft picks and free agent signings last year. We're going to try and replicate that. I will be going to the draft, so we'll have audio from Las Vegas, then development camp back in Southern California. Guys, I still haven't wrapped my mind around the Darcy Kemper trade, and yes, that is what I'm calling it from now on, so get used to that. The long and short of it is we've got a lot planned for the summer. We haven't even begun to really talk about the ESPN LA news. For today, though, we've got a conversation with Kaleb Lawrence, the Kings' 6'6", seventh-round pick from the 2022 NHL Entry draft, who recently signed his entry-level contract. Then a conversation with Scott Wheeler and Zach Dooley to talk about the 2024 NHL Entry draft with some possible players he feels the Kings might wind up targeting in the first round, assuming they don't trade that pick. And to be clear, I have no idea what they're going to do. Hope you enjoy it, Kings fans. All right, joining us today, LA Kings prospect Kaleb Lawrence. How are you doing today, Kaleb?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you. We're about a month after you signed your entry-level contract, so I want to start off by saying congratulations there.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Zach Dooley and I, LA Kings Insider, we did an annual episode with Mark Yannetti, director of amateur scouting for the LA Kings, in advance of the draft, and we asked him a couple questions about some former players drafted by the Kings, and his excitement for your career was hard to miss. So I jotted down a couple notes, and if it's all right with you, I just kind of want to walk through those notes and get your perspective on not only what Mark said, but also your career.
Yeah, definitely.
So just right off the hop, we were asking him. I think we recorded this right after you had signed the entry level contract. So we said, obviously you guys signed Kaleb to the entry level contract. So how excited are you about it? And the phrase he used was extraordinarily excited. I think he said since December and January, we're extraordinarily excited about Kaleb Lawrence. Then he went back and talked about the year that you were drafted, the fact that you had agreed to attend Calgary Flames training camp.
Yep.
But the Kings wanted to have you in their camp, but the only way that they could do that was by drafting you. So they moved assets to get you in the seventh round. But can you talk us through the process of you choosing to attend Calgary's camp and then finding out that the Kings had drafted you?
Yeah, so it was definitely a weird year. My draft year, I didn't play much because I had the surgery the year before. And
that was the year that you played 2 games, correct? Sorry to jump in there.
Yep. Okay. I played 2 games, and then my agent was not talking to anyone really, and then he just heard something from Calgary, so we just thought we were lucky enough to jump all over that since I didn't play at all that year, so I was just happy to be going somewhere. And then it was crazy because on the draft day I was just kind of out playing golf with my buddies, and then I got a call from the LA Kings telling me that I was drafted by them in the 7th round, so it was definitely a really special day and something I'll never forget.
I don't want to dwell in the low moments, but was there ever a moment where you did kind of just say, well, maybe it's time to think about something else?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we had that COVID year, and then I waited all that year to play again, and then surgery came up, and you just always think maybe you're a step behind, or maybe you're not going to get it back. But I'm just honestly really, really excited that LA took a chance on me that day, and I'm going to look to do everything I can to make it worth their while.
So going back to Mark Yannetti's comments, he talked about the fact that you bring size, skill, and hockey sense, and he emphasized you don't see a package like that all the time. He said maybe you get one, maybe you get two, but to bring all three. And he talked about being excited because of where you come from and the adversity that you fought through. And you just said, you want to make it worth the Kings' time to have drafted you. I always hate questions that are like how important is or how meaningful is, but I'm going to do it anyway. How meaningful is it that the Kings went ahead and made that statement to you that they believed in you?
Yeah, it was huge. I mean, I definitely needed something like that after going through that the past few years, but it was awesome to see. And I've been working hard ever since. And it's just another opportunity they gave me by letting me sign my first NHL contract with them. So I'm just going to do everything I can to push forward and, just hopefully make that team one day. It's my goal.
You finished this last season, the 2023-24 season with the London Knights. You guys made a run at the Memorial Cup. I'm going to read some quotes again from Mark Yannetti. He was talking about when the light goes off at different times for different players. And I think he was talking about the light of understanding about what it takes to be a professional. He referenced Wayne Simmons. He said the light went on 3 days after they drafted him. He's talking about Tyler Toffoli. He said it took maybe 3 years after they drafted him. He said guys like Mikey Asimont, maybe it takes 6 or 7 years after the draft. Then he said playing for the Hunters turns you into pros. They get it. He said you've done everything they've asked you to do. You've done it more consistently than they asked you to be, and over time you've gotten better at it. And said that you had accomplished 2 years worth of development in 6 months. How much of that do you attribute to the Hunter family in London?
Yeah. I mean, when I got to London, I knew right away that that's exactly where I wanted to be and where I needed to be. And I just can't give enough credit to Dale and Mark Hunter and everything they do in London. They're so supportive. They give you all the tools that you'd ever need, and their hockey knowledge is just second to none. So I think that, they put me in a role where I think I should be a third line center who chips in offensively sometimes and also just plays good defensively, wins draws. And they let me play that role for the last 6 months on a really good team. And I think that just really helped my game a lot and kind of gave me a role on a team, on a winning team kind of thing.
We've talked to players like Trevor Moore, Blake Lizotte, Sean Walker, guys that weren't drafted that made it into the NHL. And the consistent message seems to be that they're perfectly happy to accept the challenge of not being a drafted player, right? Blake Lizotte's answer is always, it's not a chip on my shoulder. It's a challenge that I'm, happy to rise to meet. Being a 7th round draft pick is not the same as being undrafted, but is there any element of that in your game at the moment of wanting to prove that you should have been drafted higher?
Yeah, I think I'm really just trying to prove it to the Kings and just, like I said, help learn everything I can over the next few years and really try and bear down and get a spot. But just trying to prove it to myself, trying to prove it to them that they made the right decision. And I'm just gonna run with it.
So what's the next step in the summer for Kaleb Lawrence? You signed your entry-level contract. Your season's done. It's now, we're recording this the morning of Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. The draft is in a few days, then development camp, and then, the dog days of summer. Where do you expect to begin playing hockey this fall?
My goal is to make it with Ontario. That's what I'm working for all summer, and that's what I've started doing last week when I got back to the gym. I'm just going to be in the gym constantly on the ice and working with my fighting coach. I'm going to be doing all the little things and going to hopefully be ready to go come the middle of September.
How many different coaches do you have?
I have 2 off-ice coaches, a fighting coach, 3 skating coaches, and then I have 1 coach this summer that is helping me with my hand-eye and vision on the ice.
Wow. That's a lot. I mean, I guess I've never really dug into how much prep it takes to begin a professional hockey career. How long have you been working with that support staff?
I've expanded it more this summer just because I'm I'm able to do that now with everything that happened. But before I've probably added about 3 new coaches this year. The hand-eye is different, and then my fighting coach, and then I used to only train with one off-ice guy, but now I have 2. So,
what is a hand-eye coordinate? I'm assuming it's hand-eye coordination coach. Are they just like winging apples at you throughout the day to catch you off guard to see if you like what kind of work is done there?
It's like there's a bunch of lights flashing around, and they're very similar colors, so I just have to like get the perfect color, and then there's 10 different things set up behind it, and I have to run to that color, touch it, and then backpedal back. So it kind of works on quick feet, and also just like when you're looking at something, you pick it apart to make sure you know exactly what you're looking at while you're moving fast as well. So,
how much contact have you had with the Ontario Reign coaching staff, with the Kings development staff, and has it changed any after signing your entry level?
No, you know what? I talked to them a lot at the start of the year there when I went to main camp, or to Dev camp, sorry, and then main camp. But I didn't talk to any of the coaching staff throughout the year, obviously, and then haven't heard from them since I've signed. But I'm just excited to get to Dev camp in a few days here and be able to meet them again and introduce myself again.
And what about the other guys in the Kings prospect pool? Do you have existing friendships or relationships with those guys, or is it just sort of show up, see everybody at camp, and then see everybody again the next time around at camp?
No, I'm playing with Brant Clarke. I'm playing with him in a summer league this year, so I know him. He's another Ottawa boy, and then I know Pinelli from playing against him in the OHL. Battled against him a few times, and then going to camp over the last 2 years, I've became pretty close or good friends with Angus Booth. So I'm definitely excited to see some of those guys again, and just build relationships.
We're big Angus Booth guys here, so we'll add you to his tab there. How I'm just going to have you talk about Brant Clarke for a second, if that's all right, since you mentioned him. How difficult is it to play against Brant Clarke, if you ever have?
Yeah, I grew up playing against him a bit, and then obviously in the OHL for the short time that he was there. But he's unbelievable. The offensive gifts that he has are insane. He's got unbelievable patience, and he's had that since he's been 6 years old. So, but he's a great player, and I'm sure he's going to pan out either this year or the following year and be a really good player for the Kings for a while.
I'm going to wrap up by revisiting the 3 S's that Mark Yannetti mentioned, because he mentioned them multiple times: size, skill, and sense. Obviously, you can't teach size. You're 6'6", 6'7". I've seen conflicting measurements.
Yeah. I say 6'6", but
all right, 6'6", so you're huge. No offense. Skill. You mentioned a ton of different coaches. Obviously, hand-eye coordination probably ties into that. Is that something that you think of for yourself? Is that there's a skill element to your game?
Yeah, I definitely have a good touch and all that. That's not my main thing, but I think that's definitely something where it will allow me to still produce the amount that I have to, and make good plays out there and be able to play with good players.
And then hockey sense, which it's a phrase that never really gets defined, but I feel like everybody who uses it knows what they think it means. Yeah. What does hockey sense mean to you?
I think I'm just aware about the situation that I'm in and kind of what needs to be done. I think that's something that I've been told, and just something that I really focus on, like depending on what time of the game we're in, what we need, if we need to get a puck out, like I'm normally pretty good at bearing down and doing that kind of stuff. So
how familiar are you with Andre Lee and Samuel Hellenius?
I'm not I don't know them very well, but I definitely tried to hang out with those guys more when I was there, just because they're kind of like me. They're bigger bodies, and they're going through what hopefully I go through next year. So I'm definitely gonna pick their brain even more next time I see them. And yeah, they're both really good players as well. They kind of play the same game that I'm looking to play.
Well, I'm going to try not to reduce you just to being another tall guy, but the Kings have definitely got their share of 6'6" and above players right now, whether it's Lee Hellenius, Kaleb Lawrence, Jack Sparks. You guys are hard to miss on the ice. Although I wish I could have seen you and Aiden Dudas on the ice together.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Probably fun to look at. Listen, Kaleb Lawrence, appreciate your time. Appreciate you joining me today. Congrats on the ELC. Congrats on the season with the London Knights. And we will see you in LA very soon, I imagine.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Joining us today to talk about the 2024 NHL Entry Draft from The Athletic, Scott Wheeler. How are you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing well. You guys are catching me on my sort of 2 days between trips here. It's been life on the road in June, so I'm excited to get down to Vegas and sort of finish it off, if you will.
And featuring Zach Dooley. How are you doing today, Zach?
Jesse, I'm doing great. I am also excited to get down to Vegas. Not excited for the 140-degree days, but it's going to be a really cool event.
Yeah, I'm joining you guys on Friday, and my previous position was, oh man, I'm going to have such an incredibly short amount of time in Vegas, but now I'm not minding that at all. Scott, before we get into the draft, though, what are your thoughts about the Stanley Cup Final?
Yeah,
but butting up right against the awards and the draft this year.
I don't love it. I've publicly voiced that opinion several times over the years. It's progressively gotten worse.
Mm-hmm.
I know that they do it really so that they don't have to compete with the MLB playoffs in the fall. I think it's driven primarily by ESPN's desire to have them on at separate times and have less infringement on college football and all of that. But I think the NHL needs to get to a spot now where they just own their schedule, regardless of what everybody else is doing around them. I think the NHL needs a schedule that starts like October 1st or earlier rather than October 15th. We're not actually that many years away. Like for me growing up, it was always sort of the first Wednesday in October, October 4th, October 5th. And that gives you don't need a ton of wiggle room. You really only need that extra week of cushion, I think, for teams so that you don't have what's happening now, which is really, I think, unacceptable to have draft talk infringing on what should be your storyline of the year, which is the Stanley Cup Final. So I'd really like for them to push everything back about a week. We can leave free agency where it is, but find a way to be done in early June so that we're not playing in late June here for the Cup Final, because now there's trades happening and signings happening and the draft is happening. And as a result, the NHL's marquee product is being watered down by other coverage.
I remember a world where the Kings season started on October 7th and they were winning the Stanley Cup on June 11th.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that
was wrong.
And I don't think we're moving heaven and earth to get back to that either. I don't think that's too difficult a task. I just saw the Detroit before we hopped on here. I just saw the Detroit Red Wings announce they're playing 8 preseason games. Like, yeah. I don't know. We don't need 8 preseason games. We don't need to be starting in the middle of October. Get the guys in for training camp after Labor Day, after the long weekend at the start of September. Play 4 or 5 preseason games instead of 8, and then let's get on with it.
All right, we fixed it. Thanks for joining us, Scott. We're gonna.
There it is.
Sorry. Yeah, exactly.
It's just kind of funny that the off season is so long, yet we cram like 7 events into 3 weeks, and then there's like 3 months of absolutely nothing, and then we get back to it. So, Scott Wheeler, commissioner for the day. I feel like we've just fixed the NHL calendar.
So
there is not to belabor the point too long, but there is rookie tournaments and development camps that these guys have to get to, and the World Junior Summer Showcase, and so there are other pulls. I actually feel for these guys, despite how long the offseason can feel to us. These players, especially the young players involved in the draft process, post-draft, they don't get an offseason at all, really. They don't get time to really go home and train because they've got to go to development camp and then rookie tournaments and main camp, and it's just it happens pretty quickly.
So the draft is this weekend, so that's what we're here to talk about. And Scott, I don't know if we've talked about this before in the past. I'm not a huge fan of the draft, just as an institution. But we're not here to talk about that. I just felt like
you're
throwing
talking to the wrong guy then.
No, I know. Well, I want to get rid of the draft, but as long as it exists, I think it's important to be good at it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what it takes to be good at the draft. We had Mark Yannetti on with us recently, and I can't remember if it was the first time he had mentioned it or not, but he introduced the notion of NHL currency. I think, Zach, that's how he phrased it. And the idea was that even if you take a player in a certain spot in the draft, even if that player never pans out, even if that player winds up being a mistake, the pick still has value as NHL currency. And I think the two examples he gave were Colton Tubert, who he conceded was probably not a wise pick, but was used to trade to acquire Dustin Penner, which helped the Kings win the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
And then he pointed to Thomas Hickey, who did have a solid career, but ultimately was lost to the Kings on waivers. And so the Kings derived no value from the pick of Thomas Hickey. So how do you, as somebody who evaluates players entering the draft, how do you approach that concept of NHL currency?
Well, I've often argued in favor of that sort of idea of best player available, but where there's a natural pull away from that is the value of positions. I think if you're talking about NHL currency, even if a winger is a more talented player in theory on draft day, I think part of the reason that the teams take lesser defensemen or lesser centers in many cases over the wingers is because of that perceived value. If you're going to take a kid in the third or fourth round, a kid who's probably never going to play for you at the NHL level, well, that player may be more valuable to another team if they've got a hole down the middle or a hole on D. So I think that's where the conversation kind of goes for me is increasingly over the years, I have started to value premium positions maybe a little bit more than the winger side of it. And that's only because those guys tend to get prioritized in different ways, especially defensemen nowadays. Teams are really leaning into taking D high in the draft. But it's also just because long term, if you're going to take one of those kids, they're more likely to hold their value as a center than they are as a winger. I think the Vegas Golden Knights are maybe the best example of that with all of the guys that they've traded. If you actually look back at the players that they've drafted in the first and second round and then traded shortly thereafter, they're often centers. And going right back to David Edstrom in the move that they swung to acquire Thomas Hertl this year, David Edstrom was a first-round pick a year ago. I think had David Edstrom been an equal or maybe even a slightly better winger, that he actually probably still would have had less value in that trade. So the fact that he was a 6'3" center helped make that happen. So I think you have to think about those things without getting carried away by them.
The NHL, well, most industries in life are copycat industries. If someone has success following one path, there are likely to be a bunch of other people following them. Which is part of the reason I always roll my eyes when people say the NHL is a copycat league. It's like, all right, well, show me a league that isn't. Having said that, we're looking at a Stanley Cup final now where one goaltender is a high-profile goaltender who has earned tons of money over his career, was drafted highly, etc. The other goaltender is suffered the slings and arrows of, being a third rounder, and everybody, myself included, I'm tremendously guilty of this, saying Stuart Skinner's no good and will be part of the reason that the Edmonton Oilers don't contend for a Stanley Cup. We're recording this the morning of Game 7 of the Stanley Cup final. Will the outcome of tonight's game have any kind of impact on how people look at drafting goalies this year?
No, I don't think so. First of all, I think teams are actually getting away from the Bobrovsky sort of paying a goalie $10 million style of building a team. I think they saw that it didn't really work with Roberto Luongo. I mean, Roberto Luongo publicly came out and said that he was untradeable and that A, you couldn't trade him, and B, he wasn't good enough to win.
Complained about a $12 million contract as saying a bad.
Yeah.
What did he say? My contract sucks. Yeah, right.
And I mean, we saw Carey Price. Now, Carey was undone by injuries. I think Carey, even right until that Stanley Cup final that really ended his career when he played through it and then was never the same after that. It's just hard, I think, to build around a goalie that's making that kind of a money. So frankly, I think it's already been trending away from using first round picks on goalies to try and find that sort of premium guy. There have been some recent examples. Sebastian Cossa was a first rounder. Jesper Wallstedt was a first rounder. Yaroslav Askarov was a first rounder. Sounds like Askarov's going to play in a full tandem with UC Saros next year, and they're going to see what they have there in Nashville. So it does still happen, but I think teams are much more comfortable taking their swings in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round on goalies, hoping that you can build some kind of a tandem. In doing so, your goalies are never going, if your goalies aren't playing 50, 60 games, they're never going to get that big payday, even if they maybe warrant it. So I think ideally teams would rather, regardless of the outcome in this series, I think teams would rather Stuart Skinner that they go to than a Bobrovsky, just for the capology of it all. So and obviously, I think the standard in the NHL right now is Ullmark and Swayman, and having that's hard to do, but having two of the best goalies on the planet in some kind of a tandem is that's kind of exactly where you want to be, because it keeps them rested and healthy. So I think the days of playing goalies 60, 70 games are long gone.
Scott, you mentioned teams not maybe wanting to use first round picks on goaltenders as much anymore. You're on the LA Kings podcast right now. The Kings haven't had the opportunity to draft any player in the first round in a couple of years here. When this happens, when teams do trade first in multiple years, do you notice any kinds of, maybe it's trends with teams that have to restock their prospect pool because they haven't picked as much? Or is it still just a case-by-case basis when you have teams like the Kings that haven't picked in the first round since 2021?
Well, the Kings have kind of gone through two completely opposite ends of the cycle. Not that long ago, the Kings were my number one ranked prospect pool. They debatably had too many guys. I think they actually, in hindsight, probably did have too many prospects, and it became a complicated web at the AHL level to kind of unravel.
Sorry, Scott, I need to jump in here right now and point out to Zach that another human being besides me used the phrase "too many guys."
Yeah.
Sorry,
no, I just think there is such a thing as too many prospects, and guys eventually start to lose their value at the AHL level if they're not playing in prominent roles, and you can only sign so many of them to entry-level contracts, and then if you have to trade an unsigned player, they tend to have pretty low value. So they went through that high. There was Byfield, and you go down the list, Alex Turcotte. Obviously, they've added Brandt Clarke. Brandt Clarke's probably the most recent example of sort of an injection back into the pool. Brandt is now, I think, poised to play in the NHL full time next year, or I would hope he is. I think he's ready for it. But after Brandt, there's not a lot left. So you've got they're going to have to work hard and sort of hang on to some picks, and otherwise it risks getting into a really ugly spot. And I think some teams go too far in the other direction where they start to trade them every year. Certainly Vegas has made a habit of that. Obviously, Vegas either trades their first or drafts a kid and then trades him shortly after. It's almost become a routine for them. But other teams like Ottawa wasn't quite ready, I don't think, to take that next step to push in as a Stanley Cup contender. And yet they were making moves that indicated that. And they were trading first round picks for Alex DeBrincat and Jacob Chychrun. And so it's a dangerous game to play if you start moving picks and you're not ready to be a true contender type. But they've got their pick this year at 21, and I'll be interested to see what they do with it, because they do need to add something into the pool and give the pool a little bit more juice.
From our perspective, that's me and Zach. In years where the team has the second overall pick or a top 10 pick, it's a lot easier to look at the rankings and speculate as to what the right pick might be, or what the likely pick might be. 21 is, I don't want to say it's a no man's land, but when you introduce the concept of tiers, then you start trying to wait for position. Then you start mixing in, personality quirks or development paths, whether the player is coming out of the NCAA or Sweden or Russia or the CHL, whatever it is. I have no idea who the pick ought to be or might be at 21. And I've looked at tons of different rankings, and I don't have the slightest idea of where to start guessing. Do you have any kind of inclination? What any pick might be within that 20 to 24 window?
Yeah, I think I do have a good feel for the shape and sort of makeup of who the kids are going to be in that range. I have a clear top 17 on my list. I think there's a small chance that two players from that top 17 are still available at 21. They are Michael Hage. I would expect that Hage is still going to be a top 20 pick, but if he is there, he will likely be my best player available. And Trevor Connolly being the other one. So those are two names that I would be zeroed in on potentially. From a talent standpoint, at 21, if either of them are available, they will likely be the most skilled players, sort of left, if you will. But beyond that, there seems to be a building consensus about that sort of 20 to 25 range. And the names that I keep hearing in that group are Jet Luchenko, center with the Guelph Storm, Cole Baudouin, a center with the Barrie Colts, Sasha Boisvert, a center with the Muskegon Lumberjacks, who's committed to North Dakota next year. Those are the kinds of guys that I would be keying in on in that area. I think Boisvert and Baudouin in particular, I do believe that Jet Luchenko will be gone by the time that they pick at 21. But Boisvert and Baudouin, I mean, they're centers, both strong kids. Baudouin is an incredible athlete. Boisvert still has some room to fill out his frame, but he's a little bit taller, a little bit more skilled than Baudouin. Two players that are viewed as sort of projectable middle six centers in the NHL that everybody really, really likes. So those are the kinds of names that I'm hearing in that sort of 20 to 25 range.
Yeah, reading your most recent one, I mean, those are the three names that you had written in the Kings section. It was Connolly, Baudouin, and Boisvert. When Mark Yannetti talks about tiers, it's from the team perspective only. It's, we have tiers of players, and if you can get on the right end of a tier, do you do it almost the other way, where you see tiers for players? Where I know I read your bios on each of those three guys, and Baudouin, for example, you had him falling below the Kings, but with this guy could very well not even be on the board when the Kings pick at 21.
Yeah.
You do that same kind of thing where, maybe his tier is in that, say, 17 to 30 range, or it's even smaller than that. Is that kind of how you guys approach it?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time talking with other scouts about the sort of consensus around these players. I've spoken with people in Barrie. I've spoken with Cole Baudouin's agent, sort of really just trying to piece it together. Now, you have to be careful with agents, I think, because they're going to give you a range that might not necessarily be the range. But the consensus around a player like Baudouin and Boisvert, for example, has been pretty unequivocal. Like I have Boisvert myself in that 20 to 25 range on my list. I have Cole Baudouin a little bit lower, sort of view him as more of a 30s guy. But in saying that, I know that Cole's going to go higher than where I have him. And I understand an argument that says that he's a 20 to 25 guy as well. I got to know him this year. I did a feature on him. I know what makes him tick. I know why people love him. And he's a very likable kid and player. He's a freak athlete. There's a lot to like about Cole Baudouin, and likewise Boisvert, who I've also done a feature on this year at The Athletic. But those two guys, like, I would actually be surprised if they don't go sort of 19 to 25. Like that has sort of crystallized, I think.
I want to focus in on the fact that you said you have a top 17, because Mark Yannetti talks about tiers and breaks.
Yeah.
So if 1 through 17 is clearer to you, does it make sense? How big is the next tier then? And would it make sense to trade down for more picks if you could land within that next tier? If the next tier goes from 18 to 40 something, and you can move 21 because somebody, particularly likes a player that isn't on your list. The Kings don't have a second round pick or a third round pick. How likely is it to move down to acquire more picks?
If I'm the Kings, I'm strongly considering it. Because I think they have a bit of a quantity issue within their pool right now. Obviously moving Brock Faber, and you go down the list, like they've subtracted a lot from their pool. They've graduated a ton of kids. We saw the contract this week for Alex Turcotte. It's starting to feel like Alex Turcotte's close to becoming a full-time NHLer. It's things have thinned out. So the idea of them sort of restocking, not just in quality, but in quantity, I think makes a lot of sense. Now, I would also be playing the waiting game at 21, as I mentioned off the top. I think there's a chance that a Michael Hage is there, for example. So I'd be watching the board. As soon as Michael Hage is gone would probably be my stance. As soon as Michael Hage is gone, I'm picking up the phone and I'm considering moving down, because that group of 17 is then quite likely sort of over. I don't think the gap between Sasha Boisvert and Cole Baudouin and the rest of the kids in that sort of late first, early second range is enough that I would be holding on to that pick if I could if I could add a second rounder, for example, like if there's a team that's eager to jump up to 21, grab a Baudouin or a Boisvert, and you've got to slide back into the late 20s or early 30s and pick up an extra pick in the 30s or 40s, I think that kind of thing makes a lot of sense in my head.
So without getting into detail and without getting into the hows and whys, I know for a fact that the Kings have tried aggressively in past seasons to move up in the first round. Mark Yannetti confirmed with us that they tried to move it back into the first round to get Wallstedt was it 2020, 22
Yep.
that they drafted?
21.
Clark? 21. So I won't talk about other players specifically, but I know how hard the Kings have tried to move into those spots. Is it important for any team to know what the other 31 teams are thinking? Because if the Kings find themselves in that 21 spot and another team comes to them as aggressively as the Kings have in the past with a player, that without, obviously they're not going to tell the Kings who they want to take with that pick, but they might just show up on their doorstep on draft day and say, listen, here's our pitch. We want to get in at 21, whatever it is. Is it important to know which player that team is likely to be thinking of so that you can decide whether or not you do want to, allow them to have the player they want?
I don't think that's necessarily the case. If you're moving back, no matter how little or much you're moving back, you have to be prepared that the best player available where you were is no longer going to be there. I think you have to trust that the guys that you like the most when you're about to make that trade are going to be gone. So unless you're sure, Easton Cowan was a prime example last year with the Leafs. The Leafs knew that there were other, even though he was a quote unquote surprising pick late in the first round, the Leafs knew that other teams liked Easton Cowan in that range and thus weren't prepared to play the waiting game until the second round or try to acquire a second round pick in order to take him because they liked the player that much. So if the player that you like is one that you know that other teams aren't fond of, then that makes moving back that much easier. But if you're taking if you're passing on a Cole Baudouin or a Sacha Boisvert at 21 and you're moving back and you still hope to get them, I think that's a dangerous game to play because they won't be there.
Scott, every time that there's an NHL draft, it gets labeled in various different ways, weak, strong, certain positions are strong or weak. As you've done your research on this draft, broadly speaking, is there a label that you could give this draft as like, hey, it's very strong maybe in this area throughout, or it's very weak in this area throughout, and that could kind of set up the runs, falls that we might see?
Well, I think what we're going to remember about this draft long into the future is the quality of the defensemen at the top. That's what this draft is defined by. That's the story of this draft. I think you could see 5 defensemen taken in the top 8 or 9 picks this year. That almost never happens. And frankly, 2012 is the only year where it has happened. 2012, obviously 8 of the first 10 picks were defensemen. I think you could see as many as 6 of the first 10 picks BD this year, but I'd probably handicap it at 5. Like if the betting line were 5.5, I'd probably take the under. But that's what this draft, like, I think we're going to see 3 or 4 number 1 defensemen come out of this draft. And that even looking back at 2012, that never happens. Those guys in 2012, there were some good players there. Morgan Riley, Hampus Lindholm. That's what that draft was about. Neil Yakupov and Alex Galchenyuk never really worked out. But this draft, I think you're talking about players who could be better than Hampus Lindholm and Morgan Riley, who are both first pairing defensemen in the NHL. So that's what excites me about this draft. Certainly we're all going to look back on Macklin Celebrini, and I think he's going to become a true star in the league. But after Celebrini, the story of this draft is going to be the D. I think we're going to have some pretty special ones emerge from this group, the kinds of players who are in the Norris conversation or on Olympic teams like that. That's the quality we're talking about with at least a couple of those kids, in my opinion. Other than that, the only other thing that I would say in terms of themes of this draft is that it is weaker in net. There's no first round pick. I would argue, no second round pick in this draft. Last year's draft didn't have a first round pick, but you look back on Jacob Fowler, Michael Harabel, Adam Gajan, it was a really, really strong group. There were Trey Augustine. There were 4 or 5 legitimate goalie prospects in last year's draft, kind of guys who were worthy of a second round pick and were taken in the end in the second round. Jacob Fowler was a third rounder, but all those other names I just listed were second round picks. This draft, I don't see that really in anybody. And honestly, my top ranked goalie in this draft was Ilya Nabokov, a 21-year-old who's playing in the KHL and was the KHL playoffs MVP this year. So even the best goalie for me in this group is a triple overager who will become a free agent if he goes undrafted again. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the goalies, but it's the D that really make this group.
Jesse, what I heard is that the San Jose Sharks are going to pass on several number one defensemen in order to take a forward. That was what I got here on All the King's Men podcast. Scott, I just had one more for you. Broad estimation, how many hours of video have you watched on the players in this draft? Could you even begin to quantify that?
No, honestly. I mean, how many hours do you work in a year? I work a full-time job, and this is my full-time job. When I'm not on the road, which is a good chunk of the season normally, I would guess that I'm on the road for close to 3 months of the 12 months of the year in terms of days sort of in another city away from my family kind of thing. When I'm not on the road, I have a pretty routine schedule. If I'm working your regular Monday to Friday, I will spend Monday and Tuesday typically doing video, and then Wednesday to Friday is phone calls and on the phone and writing stories and finishing up the writing piece of it. So it's at least 2 days a week, like 7-8 hours of sitting down watching tape on draft eligible kids. I then obviously flip on. I'm no different than everybody else. I'm here in Toronto. I'll throw on whatever game is on Hockey Night in Canada at nighttime. My wife and I will sit down and watch the NHL hockey that's on that night kind of thing. But really it's a lot of time on the road. And then when I'm not home, it's probably about 40%, 2 out of 5 days a week. 40% of my work week is spent watching tape.
Well, time well spent as far as I'm concerned, Scott. We appreciate you taking some of that time out here to talk to us today. We're going to talk to you after the draft. We're going to get into the weeds on who the Kings actually have picked rather than speculating about who they might pick. Scott Wheeler, enjoy the rest of your day. Please say hello to our counterparts in Buffalo.
Yeah, hopping on with them right now. Looking forward to it. Cheers, guys.